This podcast is supported by Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society, and its members. To support nonprofit science journalism, please subscribe to American Scientist or donate to Sigma Xi at sigmaxi.org. That's SIGMAXI.org. Welcome to Wired for This, a deep dive into how we think, believe, change, and connect. In this limited series, we explore the psychology of human behavior and neuroscience. What drives us forward, what holds us back, and how we navigate a world bursting with noise, contradiction, and complexity. Today, we're joined by Cecilie S. Traberg. She's a psychologist and assistant professor of digitalization at Copenhagen Business School, where she conducts research on social influence, misinformation, and the psychology of beliefs. She holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge and was recently a visiting scholar at Harvard Business School and Princeton University. She also holds 2 master's degrees in psychology and social cognition from the University of Cambridge and University College London. From American Scientist, I'm Celia Ford, and you're listening to Wired for This. What first drew you to studying why people believe what they believe?
Yeah, so I think my curiosity about beliefs started really early, just from how I grew up. I went to 9 different schools throughout my education and went to school and lived in 4 different countries. And I was always in very international environments with people from very different cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, who had very kind of different perceptions of the world and beliefs about the world and about people. And I think being in all these different environments led me to really be curious about what it is that actually leads everyone to have different beliefs and how social influence processes could impact how we see the world and what we think about it and how we judge information, and how our beliefs come to be. When I got to university, I studied marketing and psychology, and I really enjoyed the parts of marketing that were all about how we purchase certain things to express our identities and how our sense of self is developed, and also persuasion elements, like what makes someone persuaded, how can you change someone's mind. I wasn't really comfortable with trying to then use what I had learned there to actually influence people to kind of buy products that they didn't need. But then I quickly realized that you could actually turn this into a career in research and kind of continue studying these processes. I thought that was the perfect career path for me.
Well, selfishly, I'm glad you pivoted away from marketing because your current job is very cool. But before we dive too deep into your work, I want to make sure that we understand the distinction between disinformation and misinformation. They're not the same, right? What's the difference?
So normally, at least in the research world, when we talk about misinformation is meant to be any information that turns out to be false or misleading or inaccurate, but it doesn't have to be on purpose. For example, if a journalist misinterprets a scientific article and kind of writes it in a wrong way, or something that is published that actually later turns out to be false, or someone simply doesn't have enough expertise to write what they're writing, but they're not trying to actively mislead someone, then we would call it misinformation. But disinformation is when someone actively is trying to mislead you or manipulate you or spread falsehoods intentionally. And then sometimes we add a third one, which is then propaganda, which is like a disinformation with a specific political intent, because disinformation could have, other intentions than just political.
It sounds like all 3 of these are bad, but do they differ in terms of how potentially dangerous they can be?
I think each one can be dangerous in different ways, and it all comes down to the information, the share, and what kind of ends up happening in social networks when it spreads.
In case you missed it, Dr. Philip Lorenz-Breen told us all about the spread of information across social networks in episode 4 of this series. Add it to your queue if you need to catch up. But for now, back to Cecilie.
Misinformation. Some recent work shows that information that is simply just misleading or framing, for example, vaccines as being dangerous because they kind of link it with autism, but also often misinformation or things that are kind of mildly misleading or where the narrative is kind of spun in an unintentionally framed way, that can end up spreading further because these are often things that come from very popular outlets that people have high trust in. So they'll end up being kind of more influential, even though the kind of the level of the danger of that misinformation might, at the information level, not be as dangerous. Whereas then with disinformation, sometimes when it's intentional or when it's kind of more orchestrated and large scale, potentially each individual article would have less of an effect, but it might be strategically spread a lot more. Often misinformation is also spread because someone wants to share a piece of information that they either, want to share with their network because they think, oh, this is important for people to know. And then when they share it online, they are not intending to mislead anyone, but they themselves are not realizing that this is actually misinformation.
One example of this, back in December, a bunch of news outlets published write-ups of this peer-reviewed chemistry paper saying that black plastic kitchenware could be slowly poisoning us. You might have seen one of these articles telling you to throw away your black spatulas. But a tiny typo in the original paper meant that the amount of toxins actually shed by these utensils was overstated by an order of magnitude and published everywhere.
When it later turns out to be false, it's kind of impossible to take that back. So in that way, misinformation can have just as large-scale effects as disinformation and propaganda.
A couple years ago, you published a paper about psychological inoculation against misinformation, where you describe misinformation as spreading like a contagious virus that we could potentially vaccinate against, in a sense. I have a couple questions about this. First, what makes false information so infectious?
For one, false information tends to be very shocking. It tends to be much more kind of novel sounding. Usually it's made to grab people's attention, whether it is, intentionally fake or just intentionally shocking because it's a journalist wanting to kind of highlight something. It also plays on negative emotions like fear and anger and disgust, which tends to kind of rile people up and draw people's attention in. When people see these negative headlines that play on things like moral outrage that get us kind of riled up, people want to share it with each other. They're much more likely to want to share these headlines with each other than something that is much more boring and factual and straightforward. And the second aspect is also that misinformation really often draws on group differences and kind of highlights or polarizes us and highlights group differences and riles us up against each other. And so when this group element comes in, it means that people often want to get involved and share this on behalf of their group or to signal some form of group identity, which means that it's much more likely than to be shared because people are sharing it for signal value as well. And another aspect is, that it's just in general highly emotional, and people are also more susceptible to believing misinformation when they're put in an emotional state. It's not the same for factual information. You're not more likely to believe kind of boring factual information when you are in an emotional state. That's only the case for misinformation. It's infectious because we want to share it with others to signal our identity, to fit in with our group, and also to signal what we know. It's infectious because we're in these echo chambers where you only follow and are friends with people that you on some level have some trust in and like in some way. And just like a virus, it can only spread via a human host. Someone needs to spread that information, and misinformation just lends itself much more to being spread through people than factual information, because facts are often much more boring than misinformation.
That makes sense. People love gossip, and we rarely gossip about dry, factual things because it's not as fun. Can you help me understand what psychological inoculation might look like in practice?
As you said, psychological inoculation is a sort of vaccine for your brain. So essentially, like with biological vaccines, where the patient is exposed to a weakened dose of a virus in order to build antibodies to respond to future stronger versions of the real virus. The psychological vaccine also is supposed to expose people to weakened doses of misinformation or a manipulative argument or tactic. And what we mean by weakened dose is essentially you don't give people a really persuasive, strong piece of misinformation, because if you kind of give them that first, they're actually going to be persuaded by that information. So you have to give them something that is somewhat weak. So either it could be the argument isn't that good. It could be that, there's some form of humor involved. You don't play on real existing groups in society, and, you don't tell people real false information. This also has to be combined with form of threat. Your mental immune system needs to sort of feel like it's under attack or it will be attacked in the future. So you kind of have to combine this weakened dose or like the actual tactics that you're teaching people.
In one study, Cecily's team had people read an inoculation message, a few sentences explaining that headlines often try to use emotional language to trick you into paying attention. Compared to controls who didn't read this inoculation message, people who were warned about misinformation were less likely to perceive misinformation as reliable.
You both need like a sense of threat in the form of affect. So like making someone aware that they're going to be attacked, but then also you need to give them the tools to defend themselves against that persuasive attack.
I imagine that, like with a biological virus, you'd need herd immunity across a large group of people in order for the threat to go away. And you've also written about the potential for herd immunity against misinformation. How might that work in practice?
That's what me and my colleagues are really trying to grapple with at the moment. And one strategy is to target as many people as we can. So making sure that all these tools are as available as possible. So one way is to gamify inoculation and have people play online games that anyone with an internet connection can access.
She's doing this now with an immersive murder mystery game called Solomon's Secret, where players have to constantly question whether other characters are manipulating them. The project is looking for collaborators who love storytelling and educational gaming. So if that's you, you could get in touch. I'll post a link in the show notes.
But at the same time, I think it's unrealistic to assume that we can just inoculate everyone. A second problem with a lot of these tools is that they tend to be picked up by those people who want to learn about misinformation and who are curious. And those people tend to actually be the ones who are the least likely to fall for misinformation. And so we're preaching to the choir. There's two ways to go about this. On the one hand, we need interventions that meet people where they are, which don't actually necessarily focus on misinformation itself, but which maybe focus on our whole entire information ecosystem and how we're like evaluating information in general, because it's not always useful to tell someone that this is a tool for misinformation because everyone disagrees about what misinformation even is. Interventions that more focus on identifying how our beliefs are even formed and how we're influenced by others and how we should also challenge each other and challenge each other's information sources is something that I think research should move towards. And then a second aspect is also that many communities listen more to certain people within their groups. We call these social reference. One strategy for inoculation is also to actually target those individual social reference that people kind of pay attention to, such that they can spread the message throughout their networks. So that we're not trying to target each individual, but we're actually targeting people of influence who can then influence others to get better at identifying misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. A final but really important aspect is also our education system. Currently, most Western education systems are built on the notion that we consume information in the same way that we did 10 or 15 years ago. We just don't anymore. For example, recent work looking at who is most susceptible to misinformation finds that Gen Z are actually among the most susceptible. The education system is still geared towards teaching us how to evaluate media sources, how to cross-check our references, a very kind of critical thinking approach, which older generations also grew up with. But that better matches the way that they consume information, because they still get information from traditional media outlets and journalistic articles and news coverage and cable news. I'm not saying that that's free from misinformation, far from, but their education matches the way they consume information. Whereas younger generations are still being taught what my generation and older generations were taught in terms of critical thinking and how we evaluate information. But I think what we really need is within education systems to actually teach students how they're influenced by each other. All these students who get all their information on TikTok, on Instagram, from each other, from influencers, from their social networks sharing information. We need to teach younger generations how it is that they're actually consuming information and reach people much earlier than we're currently trying to do, when often the damage has already been done.
Yeah. And in the US, at least, we're facing a huge crisis in science, in part because a large portion of our population just doesn't trust elite institutions. But these same skeptics might trust their close friends or charismatic people on YouTube. So what influences what sources different people end up finding trustworthy?
There are several factors that contribute to how credible we see a source. Some psychologists say it can be broken down into their trustworthiness and their expertise, where their expertise is whether we actually think they have the knowledge to share what they're sharing. But trustworthiness is often much more complicated. Something very simple that contributes to whether or not we think someone is credible is their likability. So it's such a kind of simple term, but whether we actually like someone. And whether we like someone can be if they make us feel kind of at ease when we're with them, but it can also be if we feel that they're similar to us. And this can be on several different attributes. It can be if we have kind of a similar background, we grew up the same place, we have a similar appearance, we share the same gender. But something that's very important that often shows up in research and in practice as well is if we have the same political orientation, because it signals a deeper underlying similar and shared value system. And if we kind of feel that we share a value system with someone, we're much more likely to accept any information that they share with us, even if it's totally outside of what we perceive as their expertise. I might follow an influencer who's a mom and who shares very relatable mom content, and all of a sudden she's sharing something about politics. I might feel inclined to trust her view on that because I share the same background, or we have certain attributes that we share. But also if I know that someone shares my political views on several key topics, or we vote for the same party or something like that, if they share something about nutrition, I'll be more likely to believe them, simply because we share opinions on something totally unrelated. And this is something that can often lead us astray.
A quick aside, while some cognitive biases may just be that, biases, plenty of people do have good reason to distrust people and institutions that they don't identify with, given harm that they've caused in the past. For example, the US government has exposed humans to radiation and dosed them with LSD without consent, and kept those experiments under wraps for decades. Until the mid-90s, women were rarely included in clinical trials, leaving medical clinics poorly equipped to treat women. Police and the criminal justice system are biased against Black and brown people. The list goes on and on. Back to Cecilie.
I think I would just want to share one of my favorite studies. It's a study in which the researchers wanted to test whether there's a form of epistemic spillover effect, that they call it, that if you kind of share political views with someone, you'll just trust them for anything. They basically had people do what they call a BLAP task, which is a fake task that they kind of devised, in which you're supposed to identify whether some little figure is a BLAP or is not a BLAP. And there's no system to whether it's a BLAP or not. It's just, random figures, but you're supposed to think that there's some form of system. And you can choose who to kind of get advice from. And it turns out that one of these advisors shares your political orientation and the other one doesn't. But the one who shares your political orientation gives you more wrong advice. Every time you get advice from them, it turns out they were wrong. It was not a blap when they said it was a blap. It was a blap when they said it was not a blap, etc. But in the study, participants consistently preferred to receive advice from this wrong advisor who shared their political orientation on a task that was totally unrelated to politics, even though that they were wrong. So I just think it really highlights that, firstly, people want to listen to others who share their political views, even in topics that are totally unrelated. And also, we still want to listen to them, even though they kind of turn out to be wrong, simply because we share the same views.
I think there are some circumstances where it might be safest to automatically distrust someone whose political beliefs include wanting to strip fundamental human rights from people who share your identity. But in other circumstances, there probably is that point where you should accept good information from sources you otherwise disagree with, and vice versa. So how can people overcome this strong bias, and when does it make sense to do so?
One thing is just to kind of be self-aware that our perceptions of trust in someone often have nothing to do with what they're actually talking about. It can be because of all these values that I just described previously in terms of similarity, likability. It could even be like someone's attractiveness. If they're attractive, we're more likely to listen to them, etc. Number one, it's just having that kind of self-awareness of how our perceptions of credibility are not actually always rooted in true credibility. I think we should be better at paying attention to history of events. So how have they been delivering accurate and true information up to this point or not? And kind of seeing the whole history of a person and also what they do and how they respond in the face of updated evidence. Do they kind of stand their ground and continue and not admit to being wrong, even when the evidence is screaming in their face? Or do they update, apologize, and explain and kind of update their beliefs? Because if they're not someone who updates, then we know that their communication is misleading or deceitful in some way because they have not updated what they're saying in line with the evidence.
Earlier, you mentioned that some people are more resistant to misinformation than others. What do you think contributes to these individual differences?
I kind of have the overarching belief that if you put anyone in similar context, they will also be susceptible to misinformation, and that we can't like pinpoint individuals and say this and this person is going to be more likely to fall for misinformation because of some trait. That often the context is going to lend us to believing misinformation. But that being said, there are some very kind of clear differences we see in research that highlight that there are, like, statistically speaking, on a kind of population level, many differences between how likely people are to believe misinformation. So one is age, younger people being more likely to fall for misinformation. Also quite like older people are also. So it's kind of like a bell curve. I think with the younger generation, it's just like a mismatch between where they consume information and how they've been taught to kind of filter media, which is like, it just doesn't align with where they actually get their information. And the speed at which misinformation spreads on social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram is just unprecedented, and we can't stop it. They have basically grown up in a time where even, when I was studying marketing, we learned about the human era, which is like no one trusts institutions anymore. People want humans, and Gen Z is getting information from other humans, not from institutions, etc. But that also means that, there are so many more humans than there are institutions. So there's also going to be so much more information spread between individuals that can just go viral. A recent study by a colleague at Cambridge as well shows that Gen Z is also very aware that they are vulnerable to misinformation, which is kind of the opposite to another finding which is that conservatives tend to fall a lot more for misinformation than liberals. Yet they are very extremely confident in their ability to identify misinformation, which is like a clear kind of mismatch they don't really realize. And this can be also explained by several different factors. So one is that they have a higher kind of need for certainty, for the world to kind of be certain, than liberals. They're like less open-minded. Often simple explanations are explanations that they prefer rather than sort of handling uncertainty. Oh, we just don't know. They kind of want an answer. And misinformation is often there to fill that gap. Also, there's the factor of cognitive reflection. This is our thinking style. So are you someone that kind of tends to think about things deeply and analytically, or are you someone who kind of goes with your gut and your intuition? And misinformation also often plays on that. It's targeting those who think intuitively. And often people who are more conservative also tend to kind of go with their intuition rather than processing things in a very deep analytical way. Not that they don't, but it's just on average. And of course, also education, people who are more educated are less susceptible to misinformation. If we've actually been given the skills to spot things, we'll be better at it. But also, I remember in the paper that people who were more educated had a bigger gap between their actual performance and their perceived performance. So the more educated we are, sometimes we also get overconfident and think, okay, I just had a good education. I know what's true, what's false. And that can also be quite dangerous when we don't really realize how susceptible we are.
And now with AI making it very easy to create convincing fake content, how can we evolve our psychological defenses to keep up?
I mean, it's a difficult time for misinformation because, as you said, it can be generated at scale. It's also much more easy to create things that look very credible, polished, professional, and trustworthy. And that can really lower our natural skepticism. And AI and large language models can be used to generate super persuasive content, personalized attacks, etc. But I think that there's also potential for researchers and practitioners to actually take advantage of AI. And the same tools that spread misinformation can potentially also help us fight it. So AI can also then be used to detect patterns, to potentially personalize these inoculation messages, to figure out why someone is individually being targeted by this information, to help people decipher information and headlines. Potentially, AI can be used to actually generate traffic meters for information also at scale, kind of keep up with this pace and to help identify manipulative content before it spreads. Just as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, with researchers and doctors and biologists and researchers across the world in companies and universities, they got together and at unprecedented scale were working towards developing a vaccine because of the gravity of the situation and also the immense need for a quick turnaround. I'm seeing, and we are seeing the same with AI, and that researchers across fields in political science and communication and machine learning and physics and psychology and sociology in all fields are really working very quickly at the same time as this is happening to understand how we can prevent AI from actually making the misinformation system a lot worse.
Before we wrap up, I'd love to ask for some advice. First, what does your research say about how we can have productive conversations with people we care about, but who might hold beliefs we think are built on misinformation?
This is one of the hardest things. But for one, it helps to recognize that not everyone prioritizes factual accuracy. Maybe that's like an insult to some, but I don't mean it in that way. But just that for some people, what matters most is whether something feels true, whether it aligns with their values, their community, or their lived experience. Even the people who don't care that much about what truth is or what is true, they care about autonomy. So they don't want to be manipulated or lied to. Instead of saying to someone that's false, it can sometimes be more effective to ask whether they're sure that the people promoting that are acting in their best interest, get them to identify the underlying motivations of whoever they're getting this information from, and to see whether, there could be an alternative motive for sharing this information. It also never works to just tell someone that something is factually incorrect if their belief is deeply ingrained in values. And therefore, it can be really beneficial to actually just hear someone out and help them explain why it is that they have come to have that belief in general. And once you kind of see why someone holds that belief, it's easier to kind of understand how they got there. And once you understand how they got there, you can tackle the underlying reasons for their belief in that kind of piece of misinformation. You can talk about that rather than just coming with one simple fact that you expect is going to refute that. A final thing is also that sometimes we can't change people's false perceptions, and sometimes we need to not talk about misinformation if it's not something that is, let's say, like damaging to their health or damaging to their social lives, or it's just a belief that they hold that is technically untrue. There's also no need to go in and try to change that. When it becomes important is when it's actually impacting their health or like the societal health or well-being, or their social lives, or impacting others negatively. Then it's quite important to talk about. But then it's also, maybe the final thing is to figure out whether you are the right messenger of this inoculation or information, or whether there's someone that they're actually going to trust more. Because as we just talked about, if you kind of share very different political perspectives, potentially you are not going to be the one that's most effective at changing a deeply ingrained false belief in that individual, and someone else would have a better shot at that.
All very helpful. Cecilie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Cecilie Traberg for joining in on this episode of Wired for This. You can find links to our sources in the episode description. You've been listening to a podcast by American Scientist, published by Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society. Wired for This is produced and edited by Nwabata Nnani and hosted by me, Celia Ford. Thanks for listening.